The mineral sodium chloride, better known as salt. Whether you knew it or not, it's an important item on your grocery list. Salt is one of several dozen essential nutrients for the human body, and without it, we wouldn't be able to survive. The human body doesn't retain salt for very long, so we need to consume it on a regular basis. When used correctly, salt can minimize bitterness, balance out sweetness, and enhance aromas. But there's so many different salts out there. What's the difference between kosher salt, pink salt, table salt, sea salt? And why does the price range from $1 all the way up to $20? Is salt really that essential?
It can be a bit overwhelming. Let's dive in. So why is salt so important? And what does salt do? Well, it's actually one of the most popular ingredients or seasoning in the entire world. And yeah, you probably guessed it. Pepper comes in at number 2. Salt can do great things. It brings out complex, hidden flavor profiles in your food and brings them forward so you can easily taste them. Also, when you start playing with salt and sugar, really interesting things can happen. Later on, I'll tell you what are some of my favorite brands and what chefs love to use, and how I particularly use them. One more thing, if you found this video informative or entertaining, please consider subscribing and joining our channel memberships so we can continue making videos like this one.
Understanding how salt works will allow you to make better decisions on how and when to use salt to improve textures and season your food properly. Sometimes salt just simply needs enough time to do its work. The distribution of salt can be explained through 2 chemical processes and nature's tendency to always try to find equilibrium. And this can be explained by osmosis and diffusion. In food, the movement of water across a cell wall from the less salty side to the saltier side is called osmosis. Diffusion, on the other hand, is often a slower process of salt moving from a saltier environment to a less saltier one until it's evenly distributed. But the grain structures of salt are also equally important. Kosher salt is one of the most versatile salts in the kitchen, and it's often a popular choice when seasoning meat because of its grain or crystal sizes. They're thinner and they lay flatter, infusing itself into meats better. And likewise, sea salt is often a very popular choice as a finishing salt because it has larger, flakier, and different shaped crystals.
There's also an important thing to remember when considering which brand of salt to buy. Not all brands are created equal, and certain brands may be more intense than others, and believe it or not, may actually have other ingredients besides, well, salt. Let me show you guys what I mean.
The confusion can be illustrated by looking at kosher salt, one of the most popular salts out there, and 3 different brands. The first one by Maldon. The second one by Nature's Supreme, which are both coarse kosher salts, but they look and are very different from one another. And the last one, which is a flakier kosher salt made by Diamond Crystal. The differences may not be very obvious to some of you, but when we take a look at the back, the label, that's when things become very clear. Diamond Crystal has all natural ingredients. The ingredient's just salt. Nature's Supreme, just kosher salt. But if we take a look at Maldon, well, now we can find some anti-caking agents, and it's no longer simply just salt. 3 very popular brands with different textures, different ingredients, and different flavor profiles. Maldon has 21% sodium compared to just 12% sodium for Diamond Crystal, and 19% for Nature's Supreme, making Maldon the saltier of the kosher salts. But why? Let's take a closer look. Nature's Supreme comes in second place in terms of saltiness, and if we take a look at the crystals, they actually resemble Maldon, which we'll look at a little bit later. The crystals aren't too thick, but they're also uniform and consistent with some elongated pieces. Now, let's take a look at Diamond Crystal. And right away, you can tell that it's a lot more flaky. There's different varieties of sizes, different shapes. It's thinner, it's going to sit flatter, and some of the crystals are larger. All of these factors taken into consideration will give you a less saltier salt. Finally, if we take a look at Maldon, which has the most uniform crystals that are thicker, larger, and resemble table salt. Simply put, the more air that's in between the crystals, the less saltier it's going to get. It's less dense, less packed. So all this in consideration will give you a saltier salt. I've already kind of alluded to it, but I prefer salt that's pure, with no added chemicals. By far, kosher salt is the most used and most versatile companion in the kitchen. And for that, I prefer Diamond Crystal, the flaky version, which is also a favorite among chefs. It's not overpowering, it has a great texture and a crunch. Now, if you're on a budget, Nature Supreme is a great alternative and similar to Maldon. But without the added ingredients, and it's a bit more gentle. Maldon, on the other hand, has a bit more of that table salt taste. It's definitely stronger and overpowering, so add it carefully. These three kosher salts taste very different with different textures. I can understand why this topic is often overlooked by new cooks who are confused or even intimidated by the subject. Now, I also enjoy Himalayan Pink Salt from time to time, specifically brands that are actually imported from around that region. Himalayan salt is a great substitute for really anything. It's versatile enough to be used as a cooking, seasoning, or finishing salt, and it has a unique note to it. And I usually use it as a finishing salt. Which brings me to my favorite finishing salt made by Maldon, and it's a sea salt, a very common seasoning salt in restaurants where I was first exposed to it. I prefer finishing salt to be very flaky, and sea salt has the texture and crunch that takes a steak to a whole nother level. Maldon usually has large flakes, but they're thin, so when you rest it on your tongue, it's not overpowering, it gently dissolves and starts to give you some of that flavor. But as soon as you crunch, you get a really satisfying crunch and then everything gets released. So it does a great job as a finishing salt for that very reason. Now, we've talked about kosher salt, and by far my favorite kosher salt is Diamond Crystal. And of course, sea salt, my finishing salt, which is Maldon. And we've talked about pink salt, which is very versatile. But in order to understand salt a bit more, let's look at a finer grained salt. The salt that everybody has that's readily available that's often misused, which is table salt. And beginners will use table salt to season their meats, which is a mistake. Table salt looks much more uniform, with smaller grains or smaller crystals that are densely packed. There's less air in between. These smaller crystals get absorbed in your tongue instantaneously, which gives you that salty taste. Now, I'm not going to get into the health aspects of all the different salts out there. Some research has found that Himalayan pink salt can be a healthy substitute that can lower blood pressure and serve as an antioxidant. Other research has also found that the added ingredients in anti-clumping or anti-caking agents added to brands like Maldon actually raises your blood pressure. And there's a whole history around salt with iodine that I'm sure will spark debate in the comment section. What I do want to say, like anything out there, even if it's good for you, consume it in moderations. Even water can kill you if you have too much of it. As I've already demonstrated to you earlier in this video, the larger or coarser the grind, the more you're usually going to have to add to achieve the same saltiness. But brands are also very different from one another. Always check the back of the label and compare the two, and if you can, try to taste them. Maldon is much saltier than Diamond Crystal, for example, even though they're both considered coarse kosher salt. It takes a bit of trial and error until you can get the hang of it, but try to add salt in gradually as you taste it if you can. Obviously, you can't taste raw pieces of meat when seasoning, so what I usually do if I'm unsure, I'll try to be a bit conservative on a steak, for example. And then when it's cooked, I'll taste a bit and add in my finishing salt. I highly recommend you start off with 2 in your kitchen: Diamond Crystal Kosher Salt and Maldon Finishing Sea Salt. I'll have links in the description of this video to all the salts that I mentioned or used today, if you're interested. I generally prefer gentler salts because it helps me better control my seasoning, like Diamond Crystal. So, is salt really that important? Absolutely. If you cooked 2 chickens and the only difference was if one was salted or not, you would taste a huge difference. The same thing goes for vegetables like carrots, for example. There would be a huge difference in the salted food item. That salt's going to enhance the flavor and bring it forward so you can easily taste it. How can you learn to properly salt or season your food? It's by trial and error. You'll cross a line one day and things will be too salty. I've done that before, and you'll learn from it. It's important to test that boundary, and the goal is to avoid crossing that line, or less often, the older that you get and the more experience that you get. That's it for me, guys. I hope you found this video informative, and I will catch you on the next one. Take care, everybody.